to talk a little bit about annual cycles. Annual cycles might be more appropriately named seasonal cycles if we're thinking about birds across latitudes and in different environments. But thinking in a temperate zone mindset, which is where we are, it really is thinking about the way that birds organize very important, energy expensive life events across a calendar year. So these events are events that require a lot of energy, and these include reproduction, molting, and if the bird is migratory, migration. All of these events tend to take a lot of energy, and they tend to be cued by environmental cues that triggers the release of certain hormones. So there's a strong interaction between the endocrine system of a bird and environmental cues that will cue the bird to enter either a phase of reproduction, molting, or if it migrates, migration. Here is a really simple model for a feral pigeon. Feral pigeons don't migrate, and so this is how it tends to work for those two events for a pigeon. If the cues are food and mates, okay? And so there are other cues such as young leaving the nest and fledging, but the major cues are food and mates. And so when there is ample food supply, an abundance of food, and a mate is present, that cues the bird to engage in breeding, reproduction. Reproduction is expensive. The bird must lay eggs. It tends to be expensive enough that both adults in most bird species are feeding young and feeding fledglings, and so there has to be ample food supply. So when those are there, the pigeon engages in breeding. When the young fledge or leave the nest and become independent, or if a mate is lost, the bird will then, that's a cue to the bird, either young leaving the nest or a mate being lost. That's a cue to the bird to move out of breeding phase and begin molting, changing its feathers. Molting, you've heard in other lectures, is an expensive, energetically expensive event. It doesn't tend to have the high daily level of energy expenditure you might find with breeding or migration, but it tends to occur over a fairly long period of time, and it does require excess amount of energy over sort of the basal metabolic rate. And it's also an extremely important event. Birds must molt and change their feathers in order to thermoregulate and to move. Most of them fly, but they also require fresh feathers for swimming and for other types of movements. So mate is lost or young become independent, the bird will engage in molting. If there's no mate, so the conditions are right, but there's no mate, the bird may not go into breeding condition. But it tends to, if there's good food supply, it will begin engaging in the type of breeding condition that might lead to its finding a mate. If there is food available but not sufficient food for breeding, the bird may stay in a molting phase. And so once the conditions change again, if the bird is in molting phase, there's good food and a mate present, it will move back into breeding, okay? And sometimes you can have loops in these cycles where a bird may engage in several breeding attempts or several breeding events as long as there's ample food before it will go into molting phase. And so there's a gradient of those cues that might influence whether the bird's switching between breeding and molting. So here is an annual life cycle of a migratory population of white-crowned sparrows. Each stage, and those are represented by these different squares, is triggered by different kinds of environmental cues. And so this again is a schematic model, but it's based on actual research. So there are a number of environmental cues that will trigger a suite of hormones in the sparrow that will lead to behaviors and actually physiological functions involved with all three things: reproduction, migration, and molting. And so During autumnal and vernal migration, quite often the cues have to do with temperature and also changes in day length. Those are important cues to telling a bird when it's time to migrate. Day length is also important in triggering activities such as breeding and molt, and melatonin is involved in this process. But there are other cues such as temperature, food availability, presence of a mate, and other factors. And so these cues are all interacting with the endocrine system of the bird, helping it to organize its annual cycle. So this slide really is giving us some information about the circadian rhythm of birds and how this plays a role in these different functions. And so the circadian rhythm are these daily rhythms of activity and rest in an organism's daily cycle. And this image, what we're looking at, are images of activity patterns in common chaffinches. This is a European type of bird. And these are two profiles of two individuals here that are kept in a dimly lit environment and have a daily activity cycle. And so on the x-axis here, we have time and day, so each number is a day. On the y-axis in each chart, we have oxygen uptake. And so high oxygen uptake represents a more metabolically active period of time. And so when that organism is taking up a lot of oxygen, it's moving around, it's having a lot of energy requirements. That tends to be the daylight time for birds and for humans. And then the low oxygen times are periods of time that have low activity. And so you can see under a light-dark cycle, you can see here in this range of days where you see these gray bars and the lighter bars, you have a clock where you have an activity at the beginning of the light or somewhere in this time period where there's light happening, and then a low drop in the red line during the periods of dark. And then it starts to increase, and then an active period of time during light and an inactive period of time during dark. And so this different individuals will have a slightly different profile, but you do see a high activity during light and lower activity during dark. However, once you remove that cue of the presence of light and the presence of dark, and you put and birds are kept in just a universally dimly lit environment, it still maintains cycles or periods of time when they are more active and less active, but those cycles tend to drift away from a 24-hour clock. And so you see, if we have these bars here that are representing individual days, you'll see that the time in which the bird is really active is starting to shift a little, okay, as we move through time here. And actually the differential is also changing somewhat in this individual. And so a bird needs that cue, that environmental cue, to maintain an actual 24-hour clock with active time periods happening during the day and inactive time periods happening at night during dark times. And so these are other models of actual data from experimental studies where birds were kept in constant light environments so that we could see the relationship between these important environmental cues, these daily circadian rhythms, and the longer term processes. And so the top image is, we have the x-axis is time in years, and the y-axis is a couple of things. The actual numerical value represents, and the red lines represent testicular width. And then the bars are representing periods of time of molt. And so this is an example of a European starling called a common starling here, in which these starlings are kept in these constant light environments. And so they start to, this time is in years, they're not exhibiting the same pattern of enlargement of their testes from year to year. And that's because they're lacking those daily cues that will launch them in to these patterns of breeding and molt that match up with the environment that's most beneficial. And so, but something that's really useful to notice in this image, that although they're deviating from an annual cycle that would make sense in the outside world, where you have these light and dark hues that correspond with seasons, you do see that during time periods where the testicular width is really small, that molt is happening. And so you're also seeing that there's a staggering of molt in breeding, even in this constant light environment. Testicular width is measured as an indicator of breeding because birds have seasonal regression and expansion of their gonads. And so when the gonads expand, the testicular width expands. That means they're going into and are in breeding condition. And then during time periods where they reduce in size, they're out of breeding condition. And the difference in that size can be quite substantial, from almost impossible to see the testicular, the gonads, to very large. And so that's one adaptation that birds have to reduce weight when it's not needed. This is a similar kind of example, and these are patterns of molt across years. And so again, the x-axis here is time of year. So this is the time of year in months, and then here are years. And so as you move through from 0 at the top to 8 years down into this study, these birds that are kept in these constant light environments. This is a type of warbler that we're looking at that has 2 molts, okay? It has a winter molt and a summer molt. That these times tend to drift away from what you would expect to see, with the winter molt actually happening in winter and the summer molt actually happening in summer. So this constant daily cueing of light and darkness is really important for these annual cycles in birds. And the way this works is there are periods of time, the endocrine gland that's responsible for the secretion of melatonin and for the triggering of other glands to operate in these circadian rhythm patterns is the pineal gland. And there are periods of time of day where it's particularly sensitive, and it's called a photosensitive phase of the pineal gland. And so there are times of day where you have these increased photosensitivity and a decreased photosensitivity. So these red lines are periods of increased photosensitivity and decreased photosensitivity. And it's important during these periods of increased photosensitivity, the amount of light that's actually being received when there's an increased photosensitivity period is really important in determining the response, the response of the endocrine system to that light. And so here is an example of a light cycle, which is 8 hours of light and 16 hours of dark. That's actually pretty similar to what you find at 47 degrees north here in Olympia, Washington during the winter time. And so you're seeing light and dark periods being represented here. Light is orange and dark is blue. And so you can see during this photosensitive period, in that kind of light-dark cycle, there isn't light triggering the pineal gland. Okay, there's no response to this light pattern here. If you change that light regime to be 16 hours of light and 8 hours of dark, what you see is during a photosensitive period, there is more time during that photosensitive period where there is light happening. And so there's the sensitivity, and the receptors associated with the sensitivity are receiving light and providing cues to the body based on that light. And so this is what we find actually pretty close to the summer solstice at 47 degrees north. And so right about Olympia, Washington, pretty similar timing. Now, if you actually move even further north in latitude, as you know, you can have during the summer periods almost year-round daylight. And so this is a similar regime that's mimicking a much further north latitude with 22 hours of light and only 2 hours of dark. And during this photosensitive period, that the entire photosensitive period just about is being exposed to light and cueing the body to engage in all sorts of activities that would be associated with very long days. in this case, the response that they're looking at is gonadal enlargement. And so enlargement of the gonads. And so that there's a very strong relationship between gonad, the process of gonad enlargement, and day length. This is a really great element in the Handbook of Bird Biology media library. If you can go into it, and there are actually all sorts of avian systems represented here. I'm just going to click this link and share the screen of the web page of the site. Okay, here we go. And you can click here, and it's all about bird anatomy. So it's associated with the chapter on bird anatomy, which you can say go. And you can decide which system you want to be looking at. I'm going to select endocrine/immune system. And if I select it, I can actually show all of the glands and organs associated with the endocrine and the immune system. I'm actually going to just focus on endocrines associated with these annual cycles. Now, they're all somewhat associated, but the glands that are taking in, the primary glands responsible for taking in the environmental cues and sending other cues to the body to change physiology and adjust for either breeding, molt, or migration. And make sure, and so you can actually look at the functions of these glands. And so I've selected the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is the area between the forebrain and the midbrain that plays a central role in hormonal control of body processes. It's connected to the pituitary gland, and so this is one of these control glands. I'm going to go to pituitary gland. It's in the brain. It's connected to the hypothalamus, and it's called the master gland for its role in coordinating the endocrine system. And it's involved in all sorts of processes, but including stimulates the gonads, alter plumage, and development of brood patches. So it's involved in some of these environmental cues associated with annual cycles. Pineal gland is the one that's responsible for this photoperiod, this uptake of light and the secretion of melatonin that cues these other glands to ramp the body up or slow it down for certain times of the year. It's a gland in the midbrain that secretes melatonin. It's associated with circadian rhythms, okay, and it governs daily activity patterns. The thymus is not all that strongly involved in this, but the thyroid and the parathyroid glands are also involved. And they are associated with the development of sperm and eggs, the annual enlargement of gonads, and they also play a role in molt, pigmentation, and migration. And so these are the glands that we find that are particularly important in these parts of the bird's annual cycle. Go back to this presentation. So this is from the chapter on annual cycles, and it's a table 9.1, of many of the hormones that are involved in these cycles. And so we have the actual hormone, there are abbreviations, and then you can see the source of these hormones. The adrenal gland actually it's responsible for a lot of responses as well, but you can see a lot of these glands that we just saw in the avian systems. If you were to look at the urogenital system of males and females, you'd see some additional glands associated with this. And then there's the roles that are involved in these different parts of the cycle. This is a really interesting image that represents that these environmental cues vary with the environment. That's why there's this interaction between the endocrine system and the cues. Day length is a really important cue, and as you may know, day length varies by latitude. And so in the far north latitudes, for example, or the polar latitudes, during the summer months, you have light cycles that are nearly 24 hours in length. Whereas at the equator, day length, light and dark, is almost always 12 and 12. So you have equal amounts of light and dark in the day. There are a lot of other environmental cues such as temperature, food availability, other types of cues the birds might be using that vary with latitude, longitude, habitat, all sorts of things. This is an image that's representing the time and length of the breeding season of brown pelicans, and is showing how these breeding seasons vary geographically. And what we're looking at here is the dates that eggs are laid. The thicker parts of the lines indicate the probable presence of eggs. And so you can see in North Carolina, you have this more narrow band here of when the breeding season, when there are egg laying and the presence of eggs are pretty almost always present from year to year. And so you have North Carolina, South Carolina is a little further south, and the band is a little bit broader, so you have an elongated breeding season. And but it's a little bit narrower in Texas, so there's some variation. And then as you move south, so this starts with the east coast of Florida, and then actually represents some different areas all the way down to the Keys and Dry Tortugas, you see this widening and shortening of these bands, including Pelican Island, for example, that has a very extended breeding season. And then as you move even further south in latitude, and these, you can see latitude represented here in this column, you see a nearly year-round potential for breeding season as you get closer and closer to 0 degrees. Here, the lowest number is 10 degrees. But even with that change in latitude, there are certain sites where you don't see this year-round breeding season, and it might be due to wet and dry seasons or shifts in the environment that might also be cueing these birds, in addition to changes in day length that might be cueing breeding season. So here are some images from what used to be known as birds of North America, now known as birds of the world. And they're really useful for you if you want to glance through several for different species. It gives you a really good idea of how these birds are organizing their annual cycles. Something that's useful to notice is to look at when there's overlaps and when there aren't overlaps in these different parts of their cycle. And some of these birds don't have a migration, and so you don't see bars. And so the way these are organized is they're organized by circularly by the calendar year, with January at the upper right piece of the pie, moving clockwise all the way to June and July at the bottom, and then all the way to December. And so if you track through these months, you have this inner circle, which is molt, the middle circle, which is breeding, and then the outer circle, which is migration. And so what you'll see is, and I think that's meant to represent for birds the definite and then less definite parts of these annual cycles that they're going to be engaging in. It's very rare for a bird to miss a molt unless part of its molt strategy is to not molt every year. But it's a little more common for a bird to not reproduce, and not all birds migrate. So if you look at this inner circle and you look at the other three circles, you have this organization of the year where, for example, with northern flicker here, April is a time where it may be engaging in migration, in its spring migration. In September, October, it's engaged in fall migration. And the thick bands represent time periods where this almost always happens. So if you think of this as averaged over many, many years of data, the thick bands represent, these are time periods when this bird is migrating, but the thinner lines represent the range. You might find them migrating as early as, the very beginning of April and maybe all the way into late May. So that's where the narrow bursts come into effect. So you see this, and so you might see bars overlapping, but if you look at the thick bars, what you tend to see is they actually don't overlap in the core period of time in these three pieces of the pie very much. And so we have migration in this middle circle. This is breeding, and so you have this migration in April. You see breeding activity in May and June. And breeding activity is the outer piece, the outer line is eggs, and the inner line is young. Okay, so eggs, young, and then this very inner circle is molt. And this is also parsed apart between pre-basic, so this is the molt that birds that are born that year will engage in. It's slightly different from the molt that adults engage in each year. So you have the molt of young first-year birds and then the molt of adults, okay? And you can see where the young of first-year birds overlaps with a lot of this breeding activity because those birds themselves are not breeding, but the molt of the adults does not actually overlap very much with the breeding activity. And then the migration and molt also don't overlap. Here is another species, black-capped chickadee, pretty common in our area. And we have dotted lines for migration in a range of months because not a lot is understood about the migration of these species, and it's probably variable across the range with some resident and some migratory. So we have these uncertainty bars here. Here is your breeding season, okay, with eggs and then young, and then molting, not overlapping. But you see this expansion of the young bird molt. This happens over a longer time period than the adult bird molt. Chestnut-backed chickadees, although they look really similar to black-capped chickadees, are a bit different. For one thing, they're non-migratory, and you can actually see a fairly big difference in the seasonality of their reproductive strategies. And also that you see this thick bar of just a single molt. And so this could be in part due to not a lot is understood about the differences between the age groups in molt, or that there just isn't substantial differences in the overlaps of these molts. And so here are eggs, here are young, and then there is some overlap in molt, and that might represent different individuals having young fledging at different times. Pacific wren. Pacific wren is one of the most common birds in the campus forest. Really likes forests with heavy loads of deadwoody debris and a nice dark, nice canopy cover. And again, these question marks truly represent that not much is known about the Pacific wren's migration. For many years, it was thought to be a bird called winter wren. It was lumped together with other species of wren that looked really similar. And so a lot of what we understood about this bird had to do with other populations that are now considered separate species. So not a lot is known about the migration of this bird, if it migrates at all. There is some evidence that it does, so at least some portions of the population may migrate. And then here's your reproduction and your molt. And hopefully you're seeing that there are quite substantial differences in the extent and the timing of these birds, but that there are also similarities in that birds, if they're migrating in the spring and the autumn, they're breeding during the summer months and molting during the late summer. Okay, spotted towhee. Again, just walking through some more of these diagrams with, again, differences in the migration timing and maybe some question marks here with there potentially being a time period where there's molt happening in the spring. Maybe they are having what they call a pre-alternate molt that we just don't understand very much about yet. So a lot is still not known about the basic biology of some North American bird species. Here is American goldfinch. American goldfinch has a really interesting strategy. You can see its migration is later, as is its breeding season. And that really corresponds with the flowering of thistle. It really prefers thistle seeds as a food source. It's important to their breeding strategy and their energy balance. And so they have a later migration, a later breeding season, and this molt strategy that's slightly different than the birds I've showed so far, okay? And the molt is staggered to be also later, but it does overlap a bit with the breeding season for this bird. And so this is a bird that is engaging in 2 molts per year, the adults are, a pre-basic molt and a pre-alternate molt. And the pre-alternate molt is a partial molt of generally head feathers that will put the bird into a breeding plumage. So these males here have this bright yellow coloration with the dark forehead during the breeding season, and they molt out of that bright coloration during the non-breeding season. Here's song sparrows, and this one is, again, just to show you differences in population. Here's an eastern population of song sparrows on your left and a western population of song sparrows on your right. In the west coast areas, they're non-migratory, they're resident birds. They, in fact, hold territories year-round. And so you see this very long breeding season where the song sparrows may engage in breeding more than once, and then this late summer molting period. The eastern populations migrate, and there's this related offset of the breeding and the molting season and a shorter breeding season. Migration takes energy, and that's at the expense of some energy devoted to other activities such as breeding. Here is Darkeyed Junco. Again, another comparison of eastern or different populations of this bird, where you're going to see differences in migration. So migration timing are pretty different in these two. The A is the approximate annual cycle at Mountain Lake Biological Station in Virginia. Okay, so this is an eastern population. And then the B is hypothetical population in Indiana. So this is not actually, this was also in the east, but it's in a different area. And so you see these different migration strategies that are offset again with breeding and reproduction. And I know I've walked through a lot of these, but the major things to notice is there's migration time periods that are spring and fall, breeding time periods in summer, molting time periods in late summer, but there is quite a lot of variation among species in how long these things happen and how variable they are. And then finally, I have one final example, and this is red crossbill. This is an interesting chart because red crossbill are truly nomadic. They have eruptive tendencies, meaning their populations can explode and they can also contract, and their environmental cues are largely related to large seed years for certain types of conifer trees. And so they move across the landscape and they will settle when they find an area where there is a bumper crop of pine or other conifer seeds. They have this specialized crossbill that's specialized for reaching in and extracting seeds out of cones. And so because of this nomadic lifestyle, because of this dependence on areas where there's a high density of seed crop, they may migrate at just about any time of year. They can be moving around in an environment. And except for the sort of coldest, darkest winter months, and actually from fall and through December, this is the only time period where there has not been some documentation of breeding activity in this species. But you can find them engaged in breeding activity all the way from January through October otherwise. And again, this is really dependent on the seed crop as well as molting. And so the important thing to know that would be in this species is you still wouldn't find an overlap of molt and breeding. You can actually see there is this thick bar of molting time in this time period where we don't have documented breeding events, though they can engage in molt at just about any time, but it will be at a time where they're not engaged in investing a lot of energy in breeding or migration. So why is this important? It's important to understand these cycles because it's an important element of bird biology, and it's important to know that the cues that these birds use come ultimately from the environment, but they interface with the endocrine system and the physiology of the bird to prepare it for very important life events. And it's important in understanding these aspects of the bird biology in order to understand how they might be responding to changes in their environment, including climate change. Here is an image of the great tit. The great tit is a European bird, and it's looking at a mismatch model that has been induced by climate change. And so what we have here are abiotic environmental cues are represented by the orange line. So abiotic means non-living environmental cues. So you can think of this as temperature, but probably most primarily day length. This is something that does not change with a changing environment. It stays the same dependent on latitude. So you have these abiotic cues to the system of the bird, okay? And then those cues may trigger the onset of egg laying, okay? Which are these two red lines. And then food sources, which are the blue line, okay? And so this is a match. This is an example of a match model where you have some environmental cue that's triggering egg laying, okay? And it so happens that this cue really lines up quite well with food availability, the day length cue, for example. And so in the system that this bird evolved, this cue that is an indicator of food availability allowed this bird to align its peak breeding activity with peak food availability. You can imagine a bird, many of the birds in our latitude are having laying eggs from anywhere from 4 to 5 to even more eggs in their nest. They're having to feed themselves as well as all of those young birds for several weeks. It takes a lot of energy and it requires a lot of food. It's very important that when they're in the peak of this time period of needing a lot of energy, that they're also aligning that with peak food availability. However, you can have a scenario where there's a mismatch, where this environmental cue, this abiotic cue, a cue of the environment that is not related to insect abundance or plant or productivity or anything, something like day length, is still cueing the bird to go into its breeding status, but then that there's some mismatch due to change in climate of peak food availability. So there's a peak at the wrong time. And so that when the energy expenditure that's required is at its peak, food availability is not at its peak, and sometimes it may be at its trough. And this is one of the many challenges of climate change. And some birds may be able to adjust their system to cue into other cues that actually indicate food availability, and others may not. And that leads us into thinking a little bit about bird populations, which I will talk about in another presentation.